Have you ever felt surrounded by challenges, wondering if you had the strength to overcome them? In the story of Jehoshaphat, we uncover a powerful truth. Even when the odds seem impossible, God's unseen forces are at work, protecting and guiding those who trust in Him. Imagine facing an overwhelming enemy and discovering that a divine army stands beside you, unseen but ever present. Today, we'll dive into the inspiring account of Jehoshaphat and the invisible forces that saved him. This story is a reminder that with faith, we are never truly alone. God's protection surrounds us, even in ways we cannot see. Join us as we reveal how this ancient miracle speaks to the supernatural power of God's presence, offering hope and assurance that we too are safeguarded by a divine army. Jehoshaphat was one of Judah's most faithful kings, known for his devotion to God and his commitment to leading his people in righteousness. Unlike some of the kings before him who had strayed from God's path, Jehoshaphat sought to strengthen his nation's spiritual foundation by eliminating idols, encouraging the worship of God, and establishing a strong judicial system rooted in justice and divine guidance. His reign brought prosperity and peace to Judah, and he was respected not only by his people, but also by neighboring nations. However, this period of peace was abruptly threatened when a massive coalition of enemy armies from Moab, Ammon, and Mount Seir united to attack Judah. These were powerful, relentless forces with a clear intent to destroy Jehoshaphat's kingdom. The threat was so overwhelming that it would have been impossible for Judah's army, smaller and less equipped, to stand a chance in a traditional battle. News of the approaching armies spread quickly, striking fear into the hearts of the people and placing Jehoshaphat in an intensely vulnerable position. Here was a king who had devoted his life to serving God, now faced with an enemy that seemed unbeatable. Jehoshaphat's response to this crisis was immediate and deeply rooted in his faith. Rather than succumbing to fear or seeking alliances with other nations, Jehoshaphat turned to God for guidance. He gathered the people of Judah together in Jerusalem, calling for a national time of fasting and prayer. This gathering wasn't just a desperate move, it was a profound act of surrender and trust. Jehoshaphat knew that no human power could save them, and his decision to seek God's intervention showed his absolute belief in God's sovereignty. In a prayer recorded in the Book of Chronicles, Jehoshaphat openly expressed his reliance on God, acknowledging Judah's vulnerability and declaring, "We do not know what to do, but our eyes are on you." This prayer reflected both his humility and his faith, setting a powerful example for the people around him. By placing his trust entirely in God, Jehoshaphat shifted the battle from human hands to divine control, inviting God to take command. The people of Judah, united in faith, gathered in the temple courtyard, waiting and hoping for an answer. The atmosphere was charged with both fear and anticipation, but there was also a deep, unspoken understanding that they were in God's hands. This moment of communal prayer and unity underlined a key element of Jehoshaphat's leadership, his ability to inspire his people to look to God for strength. In a time of great uncertainty, he encouraged them to trust in a power beyond themselves, a decision that would soon lead to a miraculous outcome. Jehoshaphat's story reminds us that true strength often lies not in military might or human alliances, but in the humility to recognize our need for divine help. His leadership and faith in this moment set the stage for one of the most remarkable displays of God's protection recorded in the Bible, a moment where an invisible force would come to the aid of a faithful people. In the face of an impending attack from an overwhelming enemy force, Jehoshaphat made a remarkable choice. Rather than preparing his troops for war or seeking alliances with neighboring nations, he turned to God, calling for a period of prayer and fasting throughout Judah. This decision was not only an act of faith, but also an expression of Jehoshaphat's profound humility and understanding of his limitations. In his heart, Jehoshaphat knew that without divine intervention, Judah's chances of survival were slim. Gathering his people in Jerusalem, Jehoshaphat led them to the temple courtyard, where he openly acknowledged Judah's vulnerability. Standing before the assembly, he prayed a prayer of surrender and trust. "Lord, the God of our ancestors, are you not the God who is in heaven? You rule over all the kingdoms of the nations. Power and might are in your hand, and no one can withstand you." By declaring God's sovereignty, Jehoshaphat was reminding his people and himself that God was greater than any earthly army. This wasn't a prayer of fear. It was a declaration of faith in a God who had delivered his people time and again throughout history. Jehoshaphat's prayer continued with an open admission of their helplessness. "We have no power to face this vast army that is attacking us. We do not know what to do, but our eyes are on you." In these words, he surrendered not only his own strength, but the strength of his entire kingdom, placing full reliance on God. By admitting their inability to win on their own, Jehoshaphat was creating space for God's power to manifest in a way that would be undeniably miraculous. His words showed that true leadership doesn't mean having all the answers, but knowing where to turn when answers are needed most. The people of Judah stood in unified silence, fasting and praying alongside their king. Families, elders, and even children gathered in humble expectation, seeking God's guidance. This act of collective worship and dependence on God set a powerful scene. A nation choosing faith over fear, humility over pride, and surrender over self-reliance. The entire kingdom stood together, waiting on God to respond. And this moment of unity and faith would become the foundation for the miracle that was about to unfold. Jehoshaphat's decision to lead his people in prayer and fasting highlights a vital truth. There is power in humbly surrendering our battles to God. Instead of attempting to control every detail or trying to solve problems with human wisdom alone, Jehoshaphat chose to trust God's wisdom and strength. This approach wasn't just a means of escaping fear. It was a declaration of God's central role in Judah's survival and victory. For Jehoshaphat, calling on God wasn't the last resort. It was his first response. Through his prayer, Jehoshaphat demonstrated a profound understanding of God's role as protector and provider. His willingness to place the future of his people in God's hands exemplified a rare blend of courage and faith. He showed that sometimes the greatest act of leadership is not to rally troops or build defenses, but to lead people into the presence of God. By doing so, Jehoshaphat set an example for generations to come, illustrating that strength and victory come through reliance on God. In life's greatest challenges, we often feel the urge to take control, to act quickly and decisively. But Jehoshaphat's story teaches us that there is another way, a way of waiting on God, of actively placing our fears, uncertainties, and limitations before Him. The decision to fast and pray reflects a conscious choice to trust in God's timing and intervention, recognizing that He alone can provide the victory. Jehoshaphat's prayer and fasting didn't change the strength of the enemy armies. They changed the posture of Judah's heart, opening the door for divine protection and the invisible forces that would soon come to their aid. As Jehoshaphat and the people of Judah waited in silent expectation, God answered their prayers in a way that revealed His presence and power. In the midst of their gathering, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jahaziel, a Levite and descendant of Asaph, and he delivered a message that would change everything. Jahaziel spoke with clarity and authority, proclaiming, "Do not be afraid or discouraged because of this vast army, for the battle is not yours, but God's." These words carried an immediate sense of peace and reassurance, reminding Judah that their trust in God had not been misplaced. God's message through Jahaziel continued with specific instructions. He told the people to march down to face their enemies the next day, but he promised that they would not have to fight. "You will not have to do battle," Jahaziel declared. "Take up your positions, stand firm and see the deliverance the Lord will give you." The very idea of victory without physical combat was unprecedented and went against all human logic. Yet it was a powerful reminder that God operates beyond the limitations of earthly strategies. His promise of protection meant that they would witness a miracle, one that would demonstrate his sovereignty and faithfulness. This message gave Jehoshaphat and the people the confidence to stand firm, not in their own strength, but in the assurance that God was fighting for them. With hearts filled with renewed courage, they were prepared to confront their fears and follow God's instructions, trusting in his invisible forces to secure their victory. This divine response was more than just a comforting message. It was a call to faith, requiring them to step forward and rely fully on God's unseen power. The impact of God's words on Jehoshaphat and his people was immediate. Their fear was replaced by a sense of peace, and their hopelessness transformed into hopeful anticipation. They weren't simply going to witness a battle, they were about to witness God's hand in action, delivering them in a way that would leave no room for doubt. This assurance was a turning point, empowering them to take a step of faith, knowing that an invisible army was at their side. In our own lives, we often face battles that seem overwhelming, where the odds feel stacked against us. God's response to Jehoshaphat reminds us that, no matter how insurmountable the challenge may seem, we are not alone. When we surrender our fears and place our trust in him, we invite his power into our situations, allowing him to work in ways we might never expect. This divine promise of protection encourages us to face our battles with courage, knowing that God's unseen presence is with us, guiding and guarding our every step. With God's assurance of protection, Jehoshaphat and the people of Judah prepared for a battle unlike any they had faced. But rather than readying swords and shields, Jehoshaphat made a bold and unconventional decision. He placed worshippers at the forefront of his army. These singers and musicians were chosen to lead the people with songs of praise, declaring the greatness of God as they marched toward the battlefield. It was an act of faith, an acknowledgement that the true power in this battle belonged to God alone. The worshippers sang, "Give thanks to the Lord, for his love endures forever," as they led Judah's army. This proclamation of praise wasn't just a song. It was a declaration of God's unfailing love and faithfulness. The decision to put praise at the forefront symbolized their absolute trust in God's promise and his power to deliver them. Jehoshaphat knew that worship could shift the atmosphere, moving the people's focus from their fears to God's sovereignty. In a sense, this battle was already won in their hearts, and their songs of praise became their greatest weapon. This approach to battle highlights a powerful spiritual principle. Worship has the ability to transform fear into faith. By choosing to worship in the face of impending danger, Jehoshaphat and his people were expressing confidence in God's presence and power. Worship helped them align their hearts with God's promises, strengthening their resolve to stand firm. As they praised, they were reminded of God's past faithfulness, filling them with courage and hope. The act of worship became a form of spiritual warfare, reinforcing that God was in control and their victory would come through his strength, not their own. Leading an army with worship was an unusual choice, one that defied conventional military wisdom. But Jehoshaphat understood that their real enemy was not the physical forces gathered against them, but the fear and doubt that threatened their faith. By putting worship at the forefront, he reminded his people and himself that God was greater than any earthly threat. This declaration of faith and trust demonstrated to the people of Judah that no matter how desperate the situation might appear, God's power was more than sufficient. As they marched with songs of praise, something extraordinary began to happen. In the presence of their worship, God moved in ways they couldn't see. Unknown to the people of Judah, confusion broke out among the enemy forces, and they turned against each other. Without lifting a single weapon, the people of Judah witnessed a divine intervention as their enemies were defeated by their own hands. The battlefield, that should have been a place of bloodshed, became a site of God's miraculous deliverance. This victory teaches us that worship is more than a form of praise. It's a powerful act of faith. When we choose to worship God in the face of fear and uncertainty, we invite His presence and strength into our lives, shifting our perspective from the size of our challenges to the greatness of our God. Worship aligns our hearts with God's will, allowing us to face our own battles with a sense of peace and trust. It reminds us that while we may not always see how God is working, we can be confident that He is moving on our behalf. Jehoshaphat's choice to lead his people with worship serves as a powerful example for us today. It shows that even when the odds are against us, worship can become a weapon that opens the door for God's intervention. By placing our trust in Him and choosing to praise rather than fear, we allow God to take control, knowing that His unseen power is at work in ways we may never fully understand. Worship reminds us that our battles ultimately belong to the Lord and that He is able to bring victory in His own time and way. As the people of Judah marched to the battlefield, led by worshippers singing praises to God, an extraordinary scene began to unfold. With each step, they walked in faith, relying entirely on God's promise of victory rather than their own strength or strategies. They had no idea what awaited them over the horizon, but they were prepared to witness God's power in action. When they arrived at the battlefield, what they saw defied all logic and expectation. The enemy armies had turned against each other, and every soldier had fallen. The armies that had once seemed so threatening were now completely defeated, not by the hand of Judah, but by God's invisible intervention. The book of Chronicles tells us that while Judah's army was still en route, God set ambushes against their enemies. This divine intervention was an unseen act orchestrated by God, causing confusion among the Moabites, Ammonites, and the people of Mount Seir. The allied forces began to fight among themselves, ultimately destroying one another. By the time Judah arrived, they found nothing but silence and a battlefield littered with fallen enemies. God had fulfilled His promise, securing victory without a single sword raised by Judah's soldiers. This miraculous victory serves as a testament to the incredible power of faith and obedience. Jehoshaphat and the people of Judah had placed their complete trust in God's promise, and God responded by delivering them in a way that would forever impact their understanding of His protection and sovereignty. The people had witnessed firsthand what it meant for the battle to belong to the Lord. They had marched with nothing but songs of praise, and God's unseen forces had done the rest. This moment was not just a victory for Judah. It was a revelation of God's power, a reminder that His ways often transcend human understanding. By choosing to follow God's instructions and trust His guidance, Judah had experienced a miracle that left no doubt as to who had won the battle. They were reminded that God's invisible forces are capable of achieving what seems impossible, that His protection is not always visible, but is always present. This victory became a powerful symbol of what can happen when people choose to rely on God rather than their own strength. After the battle, Jehoshaphat and his people spent 3 days collecting the spoils left behind by their enemies. The abundance of riches and valuables was overwhelming, a physical sign of God's provision. This unexpected reward emphasized God's grace, providing not only protection, but also blessings beyond what they could have imagined. For Judah, this was more than just a military victory. It was a profound lesson in the rewards that come from faith and obedience. The blessings they received were a testament to God's favor and a reminder of his ability to turn even the bleakest situations into sources of provision and hope. As they returned to Jerusalem, Jehoshaphat and the people of Judah were filled with gratitude and awe. They gathered once more in the temple, giving thanks to God for his mercy and deliverance. Their faith had been tested, and they had experienced a victory that could only have been accomplished by divine intervention. This experience strengthened their belief in God's power and protection, reinforcing the idea that with faith they were never alone, even when the enemy seemed insurmountable. This miraculous event on the battlefield teaches us a timeless lesson. Sometimes the greatest victories are those in which we surrender our battles to God and allow him to fight for us. It reminds us that when we walk in faith and follow God's lead, he can deliver us from situations that appear impossible to overcome. Just as Jehoshaphat and Judah witnessed God's invisible army at work, we too can trust that God's protection surrounds us even when we can't see it. In our own lives, we face challenges that may seem overwhelming, battles that leave us feeling outnumbered and uncertain. Jehoshaphat's story encourages us to trust that with God, we have access to an invisible power greater than any earthly force. By placing our faith in his promises, we open the door for God to act in ways we may never fully understand, but can trust are for our good. This victory on the battlefield serves as a powerful reminder that our true strength lies not in our own might, but in our dependence on God's unseen power. Jehoshaphat's story offers powerful lessons that reach far beyond the battlefield. His journey from fear to faith and from uncertainty to victory reveals essential truths about relying on God, even in the face of overwhelming challenges. As we reflect on his example, several timeless lessons emerge, each showing us how to trust in God's protection and lean on his strength when we encounter our own battles. 1. Seek God first in times of crisis. Jehoshaphat's immediate response to the threat of enemy forces was not to gather his military advisors or assess his weaponry. Instead, he turned directly to God, calling for a national time of prayer and fasting. By seeking God before taking any action, Jehoshaphat showed that his trust was rooted in divine guidance rather than human strategy. This act of surrender teaches us that when we face moments of fear or uncertainty, our first step should be to turn to God in prayer, acknowledging our need for his wisdom and strength. 2. Worship as a weapon of faith. Jehoshaphat's decision to lead his people with worship was a declaration that God's power was greater than any threat. By placing singers at the forefront of the march, Jehoshaphat acknowledged that God was the true leader of the battle. Worship shifted the focus from fear to faith, reminding the people of God's greatness. This lesson teaches us that in times of crisis, worship can be a powerful act of trust. When we choose to praise God despite our circumstances, we reaffirm our confidence in his control and open ourselves to his peace. 3. Stand firm in faith and let God fight. God's message to Judah was clear. You will not have to fight this battle. By telling them to take their positions and watch, God was teaching them to trust in his ability to handle what they could not. Jehoshaphat and his people simply stood firm, trusting that God's invisible army would fulfill his promise. This is a powerful reminder that some battles are beyond our control and are best left in God's hands. Standing firm in faith doesn't mean passivity. It means actively choosing to believe that God will deliver, even when we don't see how. 4. Trust in God's timing and outcome. When the people of Judah arrived at the battlefield, they found their enemies already defeated. God's intervention happened in his own timing, requiring faith and patience from Jehoshaphat and his people. This experience reminds us that God's timing may differ from ours, and his methods often defy our expectations. Trusting in God's timing means accepting that He knows the best way to bring us through challenges, even when we can't see the entire picture. Each of these lessons is a reminder that while we may not face literal armies, our lives are filled with battles that test our faith and challenge our sense of control. Jehoshaphat's story teaches us to rely on God's unseen presence, knowing that He is with us even in the darkest moments. By seeking Him first, choosing to worship, standing firm in faith, and trusting in His timing, we allow God's power to work in our lives in ways that transcend human understanding. These lessons from Jehoshaphat's life encourage us to place our confidence not in what we can see, but in the God who sees all. By applying these principles, we strengthen our faith, knowing that we are never truly alone in our struggles. Just as God surrounded Judah with His invisible forces, He surrounds us with His presence, guiding us, protecting us, and leading us to victory in ways only He can achieve. Jehoshaphat's story of miraculous protection inspires us, but it also raises a question: does God still protect His people in unseen ways today? Across the world, countless stories have surfaced from people who believe they have experienced God's invisible protection during times of crisis. These modern testimonies serve as powerful reminders that just as God sent unseen forces to protect Judah, He continues to watch over those who put their trust in Him. One such story comes from a man named James, who lived through a natural disaster that destroyed his neighborhood. When the tornado warnings came, James had nowhere to go. He took shelter in his small basement, praying for protection. As the storm roared above, he felt an overwhelming peace, as though he wasn't alone in that dark space. Miraculously, his home was left standing amid widespread destruction, with neighbors reporting that the tornado had abruptly changed course right before reaching his house. James firmly believes that God's unseen hand diverted the storm, and his story reminds us of the protection we may not always see but can trust is present. Another powerful example involves a missionary group caught in the middle of civil unrest in a foreign country. Surrounded by hostility and unable to safely leave their location, the group began to pray together, seeking God's intervention. To their astonishment, they were safely escorted through the conflict zone by a mysterious group of people who disappeared once they reached safety. Reflecting on the experience, they felt that God had sent angels to protect them, delivering them from a seemingly impossible situation. Their story echoes Jehoshaphat's experience, showing that God's invisible protection isn't confined to the past. It's a present reality for those who rely on Him. In both of these cases, the people involved felt an overwhelming sense of peace and protection, a calm assurance that they were not alone, even in the face of danger. These testimonies illustrate a crucial aspect of faith: the understanding that God's presence surrounds us, often in ways we cannot perceive with our eyes. Just as Jehoshaphat led his people into battle with songs of praise, trusting in an invisible army, these individuals trusted in God's ability to protect them, even when they couldn't see how. These modern-day experiences also highlight the importance of prayer as a means of accessing God's protection. Much like Jehoshaphat and Judah, James and the missionary group turned to God in moments of desperation, surrendering their situations to His care. Their stories remind us that prayer isn't just a ritual, it's a connection to God's power, a way to invite His protection into our lives. When we pray, we acknowledge that our battles are not ours alone, and we trust that God's unseen forces are working on our behalf. Perhaps most importantly, these stories encourage us to live with a sense of faith and peace, knowing that God is present in our lives in ways we may not always understand. We may not always receive clear signs or miraculous escapes, but we can hold on to the knowledge that God's invisible protection surrounds us daily. Whether through angels, providential interventions, or an unexplainable peace, God's presence is a constant source of strength for those who rely on Him. Just as Jehoshaphat and his people discovered, our role is to stand firm in faith, to pray, and to trust in God's power. The accounts of James, the missionary group, and countless others serve as reminders that God's protective hand is still active in the world today. These modern testimonies connect us to Jehoshaphat's experience, reminding us that, with faith, we are surrounded by an invisible army, a divine presence that guides and protects us, even in the most challenging situations. Jehoshaphat's story and the powerful modern testimonies of divine protection remind us of a comforting truth. Even when we cannot see it, God's presence surrounds us, guiding, protecting, and strengthening us in every season. In moments of fear and uncertainty, Jehoshaphat's example calls us to turn to God with faith and to trust that He is always at work on our behalf. When we surrender our battles to Him, we invite His miraculous power and His unseen forces into our lives, experiencing peace in the knowledge that He is in control. Jehoshaphat's journey teaches us that faith is more than just belief. It's a confident trust that God can handle what we cannot. Facing overwhelming challenges, impossible odds, or deep fears, Jehoshaphat's victory reminds us that we are never alone. With faith, we can know that God's unseen presence is always at our side, a powerful assurance that we are surrounded by His strength and protection. If you're inspired to deepen your own faith and to seek God's unseen hand in your life, consider exploring our ebook, 30 Habits to Draw Closer to God. This guide offers practical ways to strengthen your trust in Him daily, encouraging habits that cultivate peace, resilience, and an open heart to God's presence. Each chapter is designed to bring you closer to God, to see His guidance in life's trials, and to draw from His strength every day. Let Jehoshaphat's story inspire you to begin your journey toward a faith that invites God's power and peace into every moment.